Jason, thank you for I'm so excited actually to drop in and speak with you. I just wonder, as we begin just opening into these notions, how do you generally understand them?
It's wonderful to be here with you too. So I tend to take quite a bricoleur approach to these terms. Bricoleur is from bricolage, which means you kind of just assemble with the materials you have at hand into some sort of working function. So archetypes, egregores, there's this constant thing as you're learning about these things. You constantly learn how much you don't know, and this can evoke a kind of crippling epistemological humility in which you're like, oh, I've got nothing to say, like everyone else has already said these things. And I've tried to circumvent that by just seeming to get away with what materials I have at hand. And so archetypes is something that I remember a younger version of me from about a dozen years ago would have really embraced them in the way that the world at the moment loves to say, what archetype are you? Or da-da-da. And you kind of fuse yourself. Oh, I'm a this, I'm a that. I'm a wizard. Wizard actually served as you had some utility because I couldn't bear the thought of calling myself a thought leader or an expert, but I needed some sort of proxy for how I manifest in the market. So that archetype served as a bit of a costume. But as Bast says in The Name of the Wind, Bast being a kind of fey creature, he says, we understand how dangerous a mask can be. We all become what we pretend to be. So I think there's a kind of cunning that is required when we relate to archetypes, in that we see them as expressions that we can sometimes inhabit, but we are not that, but it is a kind of evolving, eternal, nebulous yet patterned thing that influences the shape of how we experience things. Egregores, though, I find it quite useful, as you mentioned the McDonald's thing, I find it quite useful to take quite a contemporary lens with egregores because every enterprise is an egregore, the way I see it. You have Apple and Google and Microsoft, and they have their culture, and even though you can't point to any physical form, it exists. And then you have all these rituals that people undertake. People sacrifice most of their lives to serve these egregores. You have these dark triad warlocks that kind of coordinate the sacrifice so the energies get to further the wants of their egregore that they serve. And with that framing, which is a kind of a para-rational framing, it kind of runs alongside rationality, that allows you to kind of relate to some of these entities with a little bit more wit and wiliness than if we were to simply view them through a rational lens alone.
Yeah, that's great. Something I wonder about, I mean, when you say wizard as something which you almost sort of retreated to as something which has more of a timelessness or more of a history to it than the modern context of thought leader. There's a more of a depth there. It's been fleshed out in some of these other contexts. And it seems like archetypes have more of that history. But the word sort of humility is coming to mind because I'm really interested in the perils and the power associated with how we so fervently bind to things as human beings, whether it's a country or a company, and you could say philosophies, ideologies as well. And I think we are experiencing a time where the question of who we are and who we may need to be close to, or who can we trust, if the world that we've come to take for granted cracks that bit more and bit more, whether it's through technology or instability in the world, whatever it is, who can we trust? Who can we form villages with? All of this. And I think one of the great dangers sort of politically is snapping back to a certain in and out based only on whether it's a certain kind of religious identity or a certain approach to ethnic identity. I mean, it's even curious with that. I often even think that like ethnicity could be something approached, and it often is approached as something with tremendous richness and depth to it. A history of tradition, ways of doing things, ways of seeing, ways of carrying through story. There's so much to sort of the history of the land, right? But of course, it can be something which can be narrowed and such a low resolution thing, but such a powerful way to bind. And I wonder about the contingency of that, and the in the same way that an egregore feels like it can be whipped up all of a sudden, or perhaps less grounded than more of an archetypal sense could be. You know, if we want to organize or connect more deeply with who we are and how we can support each other and fit together and do things in the world, then understanding ourselves with more depth and how we function as social creatures would seem to be like a very like worthwhile thing to do. And yet how egregores threaten to work, I think, has potentially room for a lot more reductiveness around what it calls forth, almost as if it can kind of call forth a fragment or an inflation of a particular archetype, and maybe just turn a particular lens of a costume into the ultimate thing that then everyone's bound around or comes to see themselves and their identity through, and then starts to influence the conditions of the social world and the group of people to then conform more to that. And so there's something about the different rhythms or paces, speeds with respect to influencing change that thinking more in terms of egregore as an archetype does, I think, which is one of the reasons why this calls to me. So that's something I just wanted to kind of bring into the context. Yeah.
I feel like in the village example, you know, you've got like the cooks, the healers, the hunters. There's various roles that folks might inhabit if the situation calls for it and if that's what their proficiency allows for. But egregores, in terms of your sense of timing, I would agree they can manifest a lot swifter and they can be more contemporary of these times. And I also note that there is an important, or at least this might be what I'm just sensing, there's something to be wary of when it comes to egregores. And there's actually a school of quite earnest occult magical practice that I'm apprenticing to. And one of the first things that the teacher says in freely available materials is to not have conversations with other students learning this, to protect against egregoric influence, because you need to come to your own insight with this. And as soon as you start going into groupthink and stuff like that, you can get subsumed or kind of taken over by a stronger personality or a more dominant thought form. So the question I originally posed in the tickets ordering was this notion of when does it make sense to protect against egregoric influence, and how might one do so?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thought form's a good word. That's one that's often associated with egregore as a way to characterize it, right? Yeah, it's interesting. It can be a difficult thing to be too certain about, even though it's a question I've taken with a lot of seriousness, because it's bound up with how we can recognize our own influence on others and whether or not, you know, we're inspiring or engaging in thinking together versus whether someone's maybe heard something of what you have to say and wants to be accepted by you, or maybe just wants to disagree with you or whatever it is, and isn't as much slowing down or seeking to be part of a mutually generative flow where sort of both people are part of that becoming, part of that change, where the relationship is influencing both, but is sort of maybe approaching it slightly more from a it's very interesting because, I mean, possession is partly what's in presence here, right? Possession.
And that was the second question I posed.
And how does one know when one is possessed, in a way?
And then you think about the influence of social media, naturally, but then large language models and the memetics of our times, how easy it is to get swept up. Is that an egregoric effect in which we are possessed of the spirit of the group, if that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And you could, there are some adjacent notions which I think are relevant here. And Drew brought some of these up in a conversation we had in the network. He was speaking about simulation, simulacra. And then also there's something I think quite adjacent in sort of Nick Land's philosophy is becoming somewhat in vogue in some of the conversation I'm paying attention to. I think just because he brings an interesting perspective on capitalism, basically saying capitalism is artificial intelligence in a sense. And some of the Landian notions, as I'm understanding them, I'm not an expert on it by any means, but in thinking about terms like theory fiction, and then the other is hyperstition, which is a connection of hyper superstition. There's this sense of a fiction having the capacity to, if we hold it together and start to feel, start to believe it, start to take it seriously, then it starts to enact a pull on us to manifest it into reality. And so the link between capital and artificial intelligence in that way is that artificial intelligence is something of a pull. It's pulling us from the future, and that the mechanism of capitalism, of capital, is the sort of logical consequence of its own sort of internal processes, but all the processes concordant to it. And so, yeah, the link there being just what's attracting us, also conditioning us in turn, and also having the capability to structure how we come to think about our relations with each other, our economic relations, what we take to be valuable, and all the rest of it. So they are thought forms which can very much condition our activity, at which point they're sort of, manifesting factors in reality. And so to think of them as non-physical also doesn't necessarily ring complete enough for me, in that they're sort of like a characterization of, material processes made manifest in some way as well. And so there's this, whether we see that as something monistic or processual or just metaphysics, in which in that way quality or experience or affectivity and what we can measure and processes we can name and all of that sort of show their multi-sidedness, but as kind of one moving, becoming phenomenon, something like that.
Yeah, there's this expression that we are all the substrates of a higher order of intelligence that's effectively hollowing itself out or devouring the planet that we rely upon to live. And perhaps intelligence isn't quite the right word here, but there's some sort of effect. But what you're pointing to here, there's an important piece, like the wiliness, the cunning, the wit, the ability to recognize the move in both ways, where the nebulous becomes patent. And in the patterning, we start to manifest, and then we start to get into that hyperstition loop. And then the other way, where you look at things that are perhaps too patent and you try to introduce some nebulosity back into it, which allows a little bit more room to maneuver and provide optionality. I find that this is part of the dance of what we need to do. And so, because sometimes the spirit of a group can be a beautiful thing. You want to cohere a group together. It's wonderful. And then things start to stagnate, or things start to calcify, or things start, like weird hierarchies start to form, and power starts to, maladapt within the group. And you're like, whoa, okay. So they just start to dissolve. And there is this kind of movement in how we relate to egregore and also archetype as well. Like if we start to cohere too tightly to a particular archetype, that can lead to a kind of I think a involuted stuntedness or something where you're not actually seeing that the role of an archetype is to be a role that serves as part of a greater unfurling entangled story. So in all of these maneuvers, there's always this, wily cunning that we maintain.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, I'll just name a thread that I think is worthwhile continuing. And so I'll do that, and then I'll just sort of thank you for helping me open this, because I really think that I feel like, yeah, you've really helped to make this accessible, and at the same time, we've got a number of the factors in presence which are so sort of on the one hand concrete and nebulous, as you say, but also important. And so just for the sake of sort of our dialogue together, part of the thread that comes through there is to do with, well, what does it mean to sort of consciously or with awareness approach the creation of thought forms, or, participate in the creation of the spirit of a group? And I think partly the etymology of watcher or watchful is at least fun to maybe connote with the slightly more conscious, and as to Nick's question, potentially more constructed aspects, wanting to keep that loose, not to sort of, not to demystify egregores, although it does show up in sort of the rationalist discourse as something which doesn't have any of that flavor to it. And so I think that link is kind of interesting as well. Whereas with archetype, it does seem like you mentioned when it comes in with the notion of the wizard, or seeking something further back that might offer more of a multi-potentiality to re-particularize itself, through the singular of our time, that there's something about sort of leaning on the unconscious repository in that way of archetype, and getting that balance right. I'll just leave with a story of sort of Taryn and I. But when we went to visit the pyramids in Egypt, there was someone in our group who was really fascinated with Aleister Crowley and sort of Crowleyan rituals, which, for me, veered significantly into where sort of darkness likes its darkness precisely because of how it occludes others and can manipulate and instrumentalize others for that reason. There's obviously lots there, and lots of positivity to speak of when it comes to darkness and all of that as well. But I very much mean it in a particular negative sense here. And as we sort of entered, he began a kind of, speaking through a ritual, from one of Crowley's books, which, they had, he didn't go the full way. He kind of went like, he went sort of like level 1, if you like, but it was like level 1 of that thing. And people weren't agreed to that necessarily. And so you're in this, place where you already opened up to significance, and what wonder of history is here, and what possibility of consciousness being informed by something resonant and held in the stone, whatever that could mean. And so without, in that way, a collective binding which felt to be like properly affirmative in an ethical way, that to me looks like, well, people could go about attempting to sort of conjure an egregore in that context, and to not care for what might be like a deeper archetypal integration, right? But of activity in that context. And so that's one way I'm kind of thinking about it in a slightly more grounded way. One is sort of asking us to really, really tend to, well, who are we and what are we here with and as in our entanglements over the course of history, as we then open up to maybe sort of combining our capacities to create something to bind ourselves to. So yeah, but I like that you spoke to the both sides of, well, sometimes things need disruption, right? And then also, what does it mean to sort of disrupt with integrity, I guess. But anyway, I said quite a bit, so I'll just offer the final comment to you.
That's so lovely. I love how every time I see you, there's new words that blossom into my vocabulary, which is a hard act for most people. But reparticularize, I love that.
That one.
And affectivity, that's vibing for me at the moment.
Two classics.
Yeah, love it. Thank you very much for having me.